Hey there, and welcome to this third video. We're talking stewardship, and today I want to cover one of my sort of pet topics, if you like, the topic of debt. Now, we live in a society that's absolutely drowning in debt. We live in a world that's obsessed with debt, and many people get themselves into financial strife because they have too much debt. And the good news is the Bible speaks to this very issue about debt and how much we should have. It doesn't tell you, obviously, of course, the specific amount you should have, but it gives you the principles to think through when you are borrowing money. Now, one of the problems in our culture today is debt is seen as very normal, it's seen as fairly harmless, and it's seen as necessary. If you don't have debt, well, how do you afford to buy a car or a house and things like that? So there's very much this mentality that debt is this something I've got to have. I would argue quite opposite. You know, yes, you can have debt. There's nowhere in the Bible does it suggest that debt is sinful. It can, of course, be unwise, and the amount of debt we have can also reflect a lack of wisdom, or it may reflect a lack other issues, other spiritual issues. Maybe we're idolizing money. Maybe we're getting our identity from money, and that's driving our financial behavior and getting us to do things that we otherwise wouldn't have done. I mean, let me give you an example, sort of a confession, if you like. So when I was 21, I was a stockbroker. I wanted to be successful, but the other thing is not having my identity fully anchored in being a Christian. I wanted to look successful. So not only did I want to be successful, which, you know, fair enough, but I wanted to look successful. Now, when you want to look successful, what do you think that does to your behavior and what you do with money? Well, very simply, it gets you to spend more money than you otherwise would, borrow more money. And so I have borrowed money to buy the European car and all this sort of stuff, things that I would largely consider to be fairly trivial now and just not necessary. It's not that having a European car is a bad thing or anything like that. It's just to say that a lot of these things are just not necessary and just not that important in the scheme of things. But this is the trap. And money, as I said in some of the earlier videos, money is very seductive, and we can get seduced into doing very silly things with it. So I really want to encourage you to have a very cautious view towards debt. As I say, I don't want anyone watching this feeling condemned by the debt. You shouldn't feel that debt is a sin, as I say, but it is very much a wisdom issue. Now, there are probably two key main principles that the Bible gives us when it comes to debt. The first one is really a warning message, and that's a warning message from Proverbs 22. Okay, so it's Proverbs 22, verse 7. It says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the slave of the lender." And really what this is a warning message is that if you take on too much debt, you could become enslaved to the lender. Now, my concern with my country, Australia, is very much this. Interest rates now in Australia, and indeed many other parts of the world, Europe, Japan, America, interest rates are at record lows. Now, what that means is, generally speaking, people can borrow more money than they historically would have been able to do. It's very easy to borrow money, and you can borrow money very cheaply. But here's the problem. If interest rates were to rise from here, let's say they doubled or tripled back to normal levels, if that were to happen, many of these countries that we live in would be in an absolute financial crisis very, very soon, very, very quickly. And so what the Bible is really warning us here is that debt can lead to slavery. So I don't want you to be enslaved by debt. So I want to encourage you to take a biblical view towards it, understand the risks associated with debt, get good advice, deal with people who are going to discourage you from taking out too much rather than encourage you to take on as much as you can, which some people will do. So that's the first principle. Don't get yourself enslaved. The second key principle that we find in Scripture is this idea that we don't guarantee somebody else's debts. Okay, we don't pledge. And so a modern day example is when you go and take out a home loan, you have to put up security. And of course, some banks will think, well, this young person doesn't have enough money, they're borrowing too much money, their loan to value ratio is too high. And so they'll ask the parents to put in a pledge, what we call an equity pledge or cash pledge, to guarantee the child's loan. They become guarantor, if you like. And the danger of that is, of course, they're then exposing their own home and their own assets to you defaulting. And that's what the Bible warns us against. It says, do not guarantee somebody else's debts. Now, let me actually read you the particular passage that warns us. It's actually from Proverbs as well. Proverbs is probably one of my favorite books because there's just so much meaty financial wisdom. But let me read to you one of the passages. It says this: "My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have shaken hands in pledge for a stranger, you have been trapped by what you have said, ensnared by the words of your mouth. So do this, my son, to free yourself, since you have fallen into your neighbor's hands. Go to the point of exhaustion and give your neighbor no rest. Allow no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. Free yourself like a gazelle from the hands of the hunter, like a bird from the snare of the fowler." Now, there's a lot of good, colourful language there. But the point is this: don't guarantee someone else's debts. It may get you into a lot of trouble. So they're some of the two key principles. There are, of course, others. But the main point I want to make is this: debt is not sinful. However, it can be very unwise. And I believe that as Christians that we should be aiming as best possible to live a debt-free life. Now, some of you are in businesses that require debt. Some businesses need that to fund themselves and to grow and so forth. So once again, it's not trying to be legalistic or paint people into a corner. It's merely to say that debt can be dangerous and that we need to use it wisely. The devil would want nothing more than to see you enslaved, because if you're enslaved to debt, you will not be able to use your money to advance God's kingdom. You may not be able to move. Might not be able to move house easily. You might not be able to move to where God is calling you to go because you've allowed yourself to become enslaved. So we want to get out of debt and get out of debt as quick as we can. Now, a couple of other comments here. So one of the obvious ones is things like credit card debt. Now, I'm a big believer that credit cards are somewhat of a menace because the interest rates are extortionately high. And of course, many people, because they're so convenient, they end up borrowing and spending money on consumption items. And really, when you're borrowing money, you should do it on assets that are really going to appreciate, things like a house, for example. Borrowing money to buy a holiday or things that are a consumption, or like a car where it's going to go down in value, they are unwise things to use debt for. Okay, so I'd really discourage that. Now, credit cards, the interest rates are very punitive, usually 18% plus, and therefore, if you're paying interest, the interest bill can be significant. And to give you an idea, if you had a balance of about $4,300 on your credit card, which may not sound like much, but if you just pay the minimum, and the banks require you to pay about 3% per month, so if you just paid that minimum back, then it would take roughly 31 years to repay it, and $15,000 worth of interest on just a $4,000 balance owing. Okay, so the problem with these things is the interest is huge, interest is dead money, and of course you run the risk of not being able to spend money on other things that you feel God is calling you to do if you're trapped in debt. So we just got to be really wise here. Now, what I say with credit cards is obviously a lot of us want to buy things on the internet and so forth, but most banks will offer a debit card alternative, like a Visa debit card or something like that, and you can use those instead of credit. So lots of easy, good alternatives there to do. So that's credit cards. And the last one I just want to touch on is home loans. Now, reality is at some point in our life, most of us will want to own our own home and will have debt to do so. So the key principle here is to not borrow too much. Ask yourself, if interest rates were to rise from the current levels, which are very low, and they were to double, could I still afford to pay my home loan? Could I still afford to service that debt? If the answer is no, then there's a good chance that you would struggle to repay that debt. Now, the principle we operate under is we say to people that your mortgage should never be more than 30% of your budget, 30% of your net income. Try and keep it below that. Now, because rates are so low, I would argue that figure should be even lower than that at the moment to allow for a bit of a buffer if rates were to rise. But the point being here is don't overdo your debt, because if you want to live generously and you want to give at least 10% of your income away and all those kind of things, and pay for living expenses, raising children, all that sort of thing, you do not want to have too much of your income going in debt. So another principle here is that when you are going to borrow to buy a home, try and have as big a deposit as possible. The other thing is I always encourage people to borrow less than what the bank will give you. Banks, at the end of the day, they want to make profit, And they want to do that by giving you as much debt as they possibly can that they believe that you can still handle. You can pay it back, but they just want you to pay it back slowly over 30 years. They don't want you to pay it back in the simple space of 5 years. They want you to pay it back over a long period. So my encouragement to you is to borrow 20 to 30% less than what the bank will give you and have as large a deposit as possible, ideally at least 20%. So anyway, there's some initial thoughts there on home loans and credit cards, and of course the biblical principles around debt. The last thing I just wanted to share is just some strategies to get out of debt. So if you have debts, credit cards and so forth, list all your debts in order. Okay. Then what we want to do is put in the dollar amount and the interest rate to work out which ones are costing you the most, which are the most expensive loans. And then what we want to do is work out a repayment order. Now, generally speaking, you want to pay off your high interest rate debts first, like your credit cards, and your low interest rate debts, like your home loan, you want to pay those off last, simply because they're easy to repay and less interest on a lower debt, as in lower interest rate. And so the key thing here is you want to list the debts in order of highest rate to lowest rate. Often that's associated with smaller debt versus larger debt. Often the low interest rate ones, like a home loan, are big debts, and your credit cards are the smaller debts. Now this is good because we want to have a sense of achievement. So you pay off those high interest rate debts first, like your credit card, and the lower interest rate ones last. And the benefit of this is you're having a sense of momentum. I can do this, I can pay off my debts, get out of credit card debt, and start hammering down my home loan. You might have other loans as well, like cars and stuff, but the point here is to put them in a proper order, pay off the more punitive ones with the higher rates first. That's the general idea. So there's some initial thoughts on how you can manage debt wisely. As I say, debt's not sinful, but it can be unwise, and we need to use it very wisely if we want to be good stewards of what God has given us. Some of the resources on our website, we've got a debt schedule and a debt planner to help you get out of debt. So jump on, there's lots of free ebooks and resources to help you in this area. So check out wealthwithpurpose.com. Thanks for watching. God bless.